The United States just became the most powerful Bitcoin whale on Earth, and almost no one realizes it. While the media focuses on inflation and elections, the government has quietly built a multi-billion-dollar Bitcoin reserve. This isn't theory, it's happening now, and the silence is the signal. The U.S. government currently holds over 200,000 Bitcoin, valued at approximately $17 billion. These aren't hypothetical numbers. They're traceable and sit in wallets controlled by federal agencies. This is no longer just a story about law enforcement asset seizures. It's a story about a silent, strategic accumulation of the most powerful digital asset in the world. Let's start with how we got here. The Silk Road seizure in 2013 marked a turning point. Over 144,000 Bitcoin were taken by the FBI in one of the largest asset seizures in U.S. history. At the time, the value was barely $100 million. But instead of liquidating everything, the U.S. government held on to portions of it. Over the next decade, more Bitcoin came in, from Bitfinex, cybercrime task forces, ransomware investigations, and dark web crackdowns. Fast forward to today, and the United States has quietly become one of the largest sovereign holders of Bitcoin on Earth. What's even more stunning is how little attention this has received. There's no press conference, no Treasury statement, no legislative declaration that Bitcoin is part of U.S. reserves. Instead, this is being handled in silence, and that silence is intentional. If the U.S. government openly acknowledged Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset, it would trigger a global domino effect. Other countries would begin scrambling to accumulate their own sovereign Bitcoin holdings. Financial markets would react violently, and Bitcoin's price would likely spike beyond anything we've seen before. That silence signals long-term strategy. Bitcoin is no longer just speculative. It's becoming a pillar of sovereign monetary policy. Just like gold, just like oil, Bitcoin is evolving into a foundational piece of national power. The United States knows this, and they're acting accordingly. And this changes everything. Bitcoin is borderless. It's decentralized. It can't be inflated, frozen, or manipulated by any central authority. That makes it one of the only assets on Earth that can't be weaponized through traditional financial channels. In a world where sanctions are used as geopolitical tools, Bitcoin represents pure monetary neutrality, and the U.S. is holding it, not just as evidence, not just as loot, but as leverage. Imagine a future scenario where the U.S. Treasury begins backing certain financial instruments with digital assets. Imagine a sovereign wealth product partially collateralized by Bitcoin, or a new breed of government bond with crypto as its underlying asset. The global financial order is under pressure. BRICS nations are forming currency alliances. Central banks are rapidly accumulating gold. Trust in fiat systems is eroding across emerging markets. In this environment, Bitcoin provides a parallel system, one that offers sovereignty without borders, transparency, and true scarcity. That's why the U.S. is quietly positioning itself. Not to control Bitcoin, but to own enough of it to matter when the global balance of power shifts. This also reframes the regulatory landscape. Every time the SEC or Treasury speaks about crypto, it sends shockwaves through the industry. But now, the dynamic is changing. If the U.S. has substantial Bitcoin exposure, it has a vested interest in Bitcoin's success. That means regulation becomes less about suppression and more about integration. You don't destroy what you secretly depend on, and that's the core shift we're seeing now. Crypto policy is moving from resistance to recognition, from confrontation to control. And it's not just about Bitcoin. Once the U.S. has its digital reserves in place, the door opens for broader adoption of digital asset infrastructure. Think tokenized treasuries, think programmable central bank currencies, think interbank settlements that happen in seconds, not days. But Bitcoin remains the cornerstone, the digital gold, the immutable benchmark. And if the U.S. is betting on it, that bet reshapes the entire market. Let's talk about the average investor. Most people still think of Bitcoin as volatile, speculative, or risky. But if the U.S. government, the most powerful institution in the world, is holding it as a reserve, then that narrative collapses. Bitcoin becomes a geopolitical hedge. And that changes its valuation framework forever. You're not just betting on technology anymore. You're aligned with national monetary strategy, and today's prices still look cheap. You're still early. The biggest moves in history are always quiet. They happen beneath the noise while institutions position quietly. The question isn't whether Bitcoin will survive. The question is how much of it the world's superpowers will control, and what that means for everyone else. Because when sovereign entities hold Bitcoin, they don't just invest, they reshape the rules. That's what's happening now. Recent data from CoinGecko in April 2025 confirmed the U.S. holds approximately 198,000 Bitcoin, currently valued at around $17 billion. That places the United States slightly ahead of China in sovereign Bitcoin holdings. Interestingly, when the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve was officially confirmed in March 2025 through an executive order by President Trump, Bitcoin's price briefly dropped by about 4%. Some economists criticized the move as symbolic rather than structural, arguing that it lacked clarity on long-term integration with monetary policy. However, the administration emphasized that no taxpayer funds would be used to acquire additional Bitcoin. All future acquisitions must be budget neutral and funded through asset seizure or crypto-specific revenue measures. And here's the part almost no one sees coming. If the U.S. government is actively building a Bitcoin reserve behind the scenes, it fundamentally changes the role of crypto in global power dynamics. Historically, financial warfare was waged through banks, currency sanctions, and control of reserve currencies like the dollar or euro. But Bitcoin is resistant to all of that. In the future, nations that control the most Bitcoin could have an asymmetric advantage in times of financial disruption or global liquidity crises. Unlike fiat reserves, Bitcoin doesn't rely on trust. It doesn't require third-party custodians, and it can move across borders without permission, friction, or exposure. In its life, Bitcoin becomes a form of digital sovereignty. For the United States to hold a massive amount of it without saying a word sends a message louder than any official speech ever could. This may explain why firms like BlackRock and Fidelity are launching Bitcoin ETFs and opening new capital access points. These moves are not isolated. They're coordinated, and they likely wouldn't be happening if there wasn't quiet assurance from policymakers behind the scenes. What does that mean for market participants? It means the rules have changed. The days of treating Bitcoin as a fringe asset are over. We've entered a new era where digital assets are woven into national interests. They're now strategic reserves. And the moment that realization goes mainstream, the repricing will be violent. Supply is capped, demand is global, and if governments are joining the race, the available float shrinks dramatically. Scarcity will no longer be theoretical, it will be felt in price action. So what should investors do? First, stop thinking like a trader. Start thinking like a sovereign. Ask yourself, what do major financial powers want right now? Hard assets, non-correlated hedges, exposure to systems they don't control but can't ignore. Bitcoin fits all three. Second, understand that timing matters less than positioning. This isn't about catching the next 5% move. It's about being exposed to the right narrative before the world realizes it was inevitable. And third, and most importantly, stay informed. The most important signals aren't found on the charts. They're hidden in the silence, in the wallets that don't move, in the assets that don't get sold, in the reserves that quietly grow. Bitcoin is becoming the new quiet currency of power, and by the time most people realize it, the door will have already closed. To stay ahead of the shift shaping the future of money, consider subscribing to Wealth Signal.